Hello and welcome to Collision Course. I'm Connor Blue, and this episode will be discussing the process of empire building and conflicts that arise because of it throughout all of world history. Mr. Blue, how are you going to cover empire building throughout all of world history in just a single episode? So we're just going to get right into it. Starting with the classical period, which for all the AP students that forgot is from 8000 BCE to 600 CE. Empires at the beginning of this period were without much organization. People built communities and tribes around these rivers and became river valley civilizations, including the great Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent, which eventually washed away, pun intended. These civilizations were theocracies with religion ruling over all and influencing laws and government until the creation of Hammurabi's Code introduced in the Babylonian Empire, essentially establishing the precedent for creating laws backed by punishments, most famously the example of an eye for an eye. These societies eventually died off and new empires took their place. Spoiler, this is going to happen a lot. Greece became a successful power in the region, consisting of many unique city-states which, to put it lightly, did not get along. Athens and Sparta are a great example of this conflict, specifically one in which a militaristic society overtakes a democratic society. Internal conflict would have caused the demise of the empire if it weren't for Alexander the Great, who wasn't even Greek. He unified much of the empire and expanded into the Middle East, conquering vast areas of the Mediterranean basin and even defeating the Great Persian Empire, really just causing them to collapse on their own. And just as Greece thought they could make it, along came Rome. The Roman Empire was one of the greatest empires of all time, expanding into most of Europe, controlling trade in the Mediterranean, and utilizing the Silk Road to grow in immense size and power. Because of its large and diverse population, Rome used a series of tactics to keep its citizens happy and specifically drunk, by putting on shows at the Colosseum which one could have free beer and bread. And while this all seems great, the problem was that it only applied to the citizens of Rome, prompting the rise of the greatest threat to the Roman Empire, Christianity. Because the Roman emperor was viewed as a god, this created much tension and conflict with the lower class and women who were converting to Christianity at an enormous rate and were not afraid of death. Mr. Blue, couldn't the emperor just have allowed them to keep practicing under Roman law? Yes, and they did, but at that point it was too late. Did someone say China?
No.
I'm pretty sure I heard China.
Why would we ruin the take just to say China?
So China, another major world power in the making, grew in isolation starting with the Shang dynasty until the Zhou created the Mandate of Heaven to overthrow the Shang and to gain control of the empire. The Zhou is the longest ruling dynasty, and because of their isolated practices, they had very little resistance and built China into a self-sustaining nation until it all fell apart. Which leads us to the Qin, a dynasty that lasted exactly 11 years. The Qin brought order to the chaos created by the end of the Zhou. It was extremely disliked due to their brutal practices of enforcing laws. In fact, Emperor Shisha Wendi was hated so much that he built a stone army to guard his tomb, to protect himself from all those angry stone citizens. Anyway, the Qin did pave way for the path of the Chinese Golden Age under the Han. During this time, referred to as Pax Sinica or Chinese Peace, Emperor Han Wudi facilitated safe trade using the Silk Road. Speaking of the golden age of empires, at this time in South Asia, the Gupta Empire had triumphed over the Mauryan government. The empire flourished under this dynasty with a stable economy and many intellectual advancements, such as the creation of Arabic numerals, which are still used today for particularly everything. However, overexpansion and lack of effective local control were real issues for these empires, especially Rome. Infrastructure fell apart, leading to new governments to take the place of the fallen empires. With that, let's go to Alex for our next time period.
Thanks, Connor. Now starting off the post-classical period is the Byzantine Empire and their success in saving the organization of Europe after the collapse of Rome. However, the Byzantines were unable to prevent much of Europe from spiraling into a fragmented feudal society with only a weak connection held together by the church, which had to invent a series of wars in order to reestablish its power, but we won't get into that. It didn't go well. Speaking of Muslims, guess who's making a big splash in the Indian Ocean? Can we edit that out? No? Okay. Throughout this time, Muslim merchants utilized predictable monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean to navigate and facilitate trade of large quantities of goods. The diaspora of Islam and its practices will impact virtually every society in the Indian Ocean basin, mostly due to the applicability of the Islamic religion into essentially any society. Wait, but won't this cause hostility and conflict and... Yep. But what about... Yep. The introduction of Islam into South Asia is a game changer, causing much conflict with the existing Hindu society. The burning of mosques and temples started a rivalry that is still very much present in South Asia today. Moving on to Africa and the rise of the great empires such as the Mali Empire. And before you ask, yes, this was an Islamic empire too. Ruled by the great Mansa Musa, who quite honestly is one of my favorite rulers, and not only because he went through all of Africa giving gold to everyone, but I mean, who doesn't love free money? Empires such as Mali would soon be replaced by others extremely similar. Songhai, but would remain a successful region right up until contact with Europe. Speaking of which, let's check and see how they're doing. Oh, what? Europe isn't doing so great? The Black Death? Wait, did you say 1/3 of the population? Whew, okay, then moving on, back to Asia, where we see the rise of 3 key dynasties in China, the Sui, the Tang, and the Song. Like the Qin, the Sui restored order after the collapse of Han, but this time the dynasty actually lasted over 20 years, leading to another golden age. Yay! Next were the Tang and Song dynasties, which became prosperous because of the Indian Ocean trade, exporting materials such as porcelain, tea, silk. Oh, and let's not forget about the binding of women's feet, yet another example of the rigid patriarchy in world history. Now for the moment we've all been waiting for. The Mongols! In the 13th century, a man, well, a brutal warlord, named Genghis Khan started conquering lands across the continent to create the Mongol Empire. Pretty much the exception to every rule in world history. The Mongols dominated the entire continent, stretching from East Asia to the Ural Mountains. The Mongols were extremely successful in defeating much larger armies and ruling lands despite being the overwhelming minority. Their success can be attributed to the Mongol mentality, trademark pending, which is essentially giving their enemies the ultimatum of surrendering and paying a tax to the empire, or being obliterated through ruthless guerrilla tactics, often on tiny horses. This lasted until the death of Genghis Khan and subsequent division of the empire among his known and trusted descendants. The empire was split into multiple new states, including the Golden Horde in Russia and the Yuan dynasty in China. What was that? The Dark Ages are over? We're in the Renaissance now? Oh well, back to Europe, I guess. It was a nice break though, wasn't it? Anyway, Europe experiences the Renaissance at slightly different times, but nonetheless, brilliant works of art and technology are created, eventually leading to the scientific revolution. During the scientific revolution, the teachings of the Catholic Church will start to come into question, which will set the stage for the next time period with Davy, who will explain the discovery of the already existing and fully functioning societies in the Americas.
So before we talk about the period from 1450 to 1750, let's talk about the Native American civilizations prior to colonization. And I know you're probably thinking, weren't these civilizations around long before this time period? And the answer is yes. But I'm going to explain them because Connor and Alex forgot to. So basically, before Columbus came over and discovered the Americas, believe it or not, there were people already living there, which is just crazy. Starting with the societies such as the Olmec, who, if you don't know, and you need a reference, were the ones responsible for these giant heads in the woods, which were super cool. These people had spent centuries developing fully functioning societies in isolation. Societies such as the Inca in South America and the Aztecs in Mesoamerica also developed in isolation and were successful right up until contact with Europe.
Yeah, we did it. Let's keep it going.
Okay, as we can see, Christopher Columbus and representation of Europe has a very big ego and they need to calm down. European colonization of the Americas, however, is one of the most impactful examples of expansion and state building of all time and helped to shape Western civilization as we know it today. Once European powers realized the potential of this new world, they quickly started to scramble and get their hands on the bounty of new resources available for them in the Americas. Spain and Portugal were the largest players in the Columbian Exchange, colonizing much of Latin America, while Europeans such as Britain and France soon acquired much territory in the north of what is now the US and Canada. Utilization of these resources in the American colonies launched Europe to the forefront of global trade. Unfortunately for them, the Native Americans living in the Americas did not want to be enslaved for some reason, so many of them tried to fight back. But don't worry, European weaponry and diseases had a devastating toll on the Native Americans, allowing Europe to do what it does best: conquer, destroy, and walk away without having to pay a thing.
That's right, Europe!
The New World, however, did not only have an effect on Europe and the Americas, but on the whole wide world. Through the Columbian Exchange, Africa was pounded by European empires for slave labor to be used in their new colonies. Much of Asia saw the Europeans pass them with advancements in both military and civilian technologies. State building among the empires of Europe sparked competitions in the New World for territory and resources and are the reason many of the borders in the Western world are the way they are today. And I think that pretty much wraps up this time period, so thank Oh, right. We still have to go over the rest of the world in this time period. So starting with Peter the Great and the westernization of Russia. I don't care what Alex says between Mansa Musa, Genghis Khan, and Peter the Great. I would choose Peter any day. I mean, the man taxed people for having beards, which leads to the question everyone is thinking, would he have taxed Jesus? Anyway, essentially after the disaster that was Ivan the Terrible, who really just wasn't as good as his father, Ivan the Great, Peter the Great wanted to demonstrate that Russia was a European power just as much as the Western European nations. And he did this by decreasing the power of the Eastern Orthodox Church, building up the navy, and implemented many westernized reforms. Now, moving on to the gunpowder empires, or more specifically the Ottomans, Safavids, and the Mughals. These Islamic states dominated the Middle East and South Asia due to their advancements in technology and use of the gunpowder weapons, hence the name. The Ottomans would even last until the end of World War I, but the Mughal and Safavid empires would fall much sooner. Aurangzeb, if only he weren't so corrupt and incompetent, we might still have the knockoff Mongol Empire. Oh well. Finally, we see the rise of another dynasty in China, the Ming, who after the Mongols have one goal, and that's to be super Chinese again. After the death of Zheng He, a castrated man who would be buried in his entirety, the Ming went into a period of isolation that would last through the next dynasty, the Qing. The idea of isolationism became very popular in Eastern Asia, especially Japan, due to the influence that Western culture and specifically Christianity was having on their societies. Both China and Japan attempted to preserve culture by cutting off the outside influence and becoming more self-sufficient.
Kicking off the modern period, we have the Enlightenment, a movement for liberty and equality introduced by French philosophers and eventually making its way over to the Americas, where we see a series of revolutions for independence inspired by these ideas. First, we have the American Revolution, which ended with 13 colonies escaping the grasp of Britain at the time, a seemingly invincible world power. The signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 inspired many other societies to claim their own independence, and this historical document, that may or may not have a treasure map on the back, served as an outline for many revolutions to come. Other revolutions included the Haitian Revolution, in which slaves from Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture, revolted against the French after the killing of a few revolutionary martyrs. The French Revolution, in which people declared the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens, which gave more power back to the people of France. After this, when King Louis XVI was killed, the French Republic was established. Then, during the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte, France was able to secure a large amount of land, which was then lost after important battles such as Waterloo and their push into Russia. The Latin American revolutions were inspired by others such as the US. These revolutions ended with the creation of multiple separate countries. Oh, Simon, you tried, bud. On the opposite side in Europe, the fragmented societies of both Italy and Germany ended up unifying thanks to the influence of Otto von Bismarck for Germany and Camillo de Cavour for Italy. And while major powers in Europe lost colonies, their power actually strengthened during the Industrial Revolution. Great Britain, being at the forefront of this time of technology and industrial development, spread its influence along the Western Front, with America and Germany industrialization soon after. Because of the development of advanced weapons and the stability of much of Europe's economy, specifically Britain, imperialism began to grow with direct European influence, impacting many Eastern societies. During this time, Africa was split between multiple different European countries for resources, workers, and property. Along with Africa, China and India were heavily impacted by the industrialized Britain. India was given the title of crown jewel as it felt imperialism and the exploitation of its resources. China, after experiencing a prolonged period of isolation, suffered great loss during the Opium Wars, in which they lost control over their economy. A slight exception to the rule, Japan became prosperous at this time during the Meiji Restoration. Japan implemented many westernized reforms and tried to mimic the industrialization of Europe. They removed their class systems of the samurai and the daimyo and created a constitution based off Germany, which had established a constitutional monarch. We good? We got it? Alright, cool. I'm heading out. I thought you said we were done.
Sorry, we gotta get one more time period.
Really?
Yep.
Alright, let's just get this over with. Finally, the contemporary period. There's a lot in this one, with the creation of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and Communist China. This period begins with World War I. After the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, tensions between Austria-Hungary and Serbia went over the edge, and war was declared, with the support of Germany, France, and Russia quickly joined to protect Serbia. But Britain joined later on, only when Germany invaded Belgium. Finally, the US joined 3 years into the war. After the Allies, which were Britain, France, US, and Russia, were victorious, a meeting was held in Versailles to decide what to do about the losing countries. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were broken up, but Germany was hit with a series of harsh reparations. President Wilson wanted to restore peace and created the 14 points. However, the other members of the Big Four wanted to reprimand Germany for their actions, leading to the Treaty of Versailles. This heavily affected Germany because it made Germany lose land in Europe, Africa, and overseas, pay for all the damage and reconstructions after the war, and force them to dematerialize. During this time of World War I, the last Tsar was killed and Russia transformed into a provisional government, which was later overthrown by the Communist Party led by Vladimir Lenin. This party believes in giving equal power to all people, especially in taking away power from the elite. After Lenin died, Stalin gained power and led Russia, now known as the Soviet Union or the USSR, into becoming a more powerful country. After World War I, many different countries went through economic depression, most notably the US and Germany. Millions of people were left without jobs or money. However, the leader of the new fascist regime in Germany, Adolf Hitler, was able to bring Germany out of the depression. He focused on strengthening Germany by creating a new military, and his actions would eventually lead into World War II. As for the US, after the backlash that was experienced by President Herbert Hoover, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to get out of the depression thanks to the creation of a new movement that offered jobs to US citizens, known as the New Deal. After the depression, Hitler began his assault on Europe by first moving into Czechoslovakia and later Poland. When World War II had begun, Hitler began to hunt down and kill Jews, as he believed they were the source of all problems for Germany. 4 years after rigorous fighting across the world, with Europe in the middle, led to the death of millions, with civilians, and specifically Jews, killed during the Holocaust, making up a large portion of that. In the end, Germany lost once again, the Allies pushed inward. Later on, Japan also lost to the Allies after the US launched an atomic bomb strike on Hiroshima, then later Nagasaki. The introduction of this mass weapon of destruction created a worldwide fear and eventually led into the Cold War, a time where the threat of nuclear war and mutually assured destruction lingered between the two main superpowers of the world, the US and the Soviet Union. This led to many important events, such as the creation of NATO, which was a military pact between the US and other democratic societies. To counteract this, the Soviets created the Warsaw Pact, which combined all the Soviet satellites under a military alliance. Finally, a country that did not want to join NATO or Warsaw created the non-aligned movement in order to have representation in politics. While all these alliances were extremely impactful to the outcome of the many proxy wars of the Cold War, such as the Vietnam and Korean War, the UN had more influence over preserving peace, or really just trying to prevent global destruction. During this time of terror, many significant events triggered fear in Americans and the whole world as a whole. The example of this include China converting to communism under Mao, and more prominently the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the closest we have ever come to a nuclear war. Finally, in the early 90s, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the symbolic fall of the Iron Curtain that separated Europe was the first step to the end of the Cold War. Later, the Soviet Union would become Russia, and the US would become the primary world power. While this Cold War was a period of hostility and tension, there was some good to come out of it, including the decolonization of Africa and Asian countries, such as India. As you can see, conflicts between and within empires have shaped so much of society as we know it today, whether that be a good thing or not so good. But the most important thing to remember from all of this is that the Mongols were the coolest empire to ever exist. And if you disagree, you're incorrect. Alright, I'm done.
Speaking of Muslims, guess who's making a big splash in the Indian Ocean? Can we cut that out?
Okay, before we talk about, oh my.
Sorry, I knew that would happen.